Like, I don't think we're doing good. I don't think that policymakers are necessarily doing that kind of foresight work very well, or even necessarily learning from the past to think about the future. I mean, just to bring it back to tech and AI, when we started this conversation, um, there's so much enthusiasm and excitement now on generative AI and large language models and so on and so forth. And you would think that we would have learned the lessons from the past decade of social media and be applying some of those lessons to thinking about the future of AI and AI technology, but we're really not doing that work at all. So I think it's a huge, there's a lot more work to be done before we can actually say that, hey, look, foresight has helped move the needle, at least in the Indian context and the circles that I'm part of.
Hi, and welcome to the Quest for Better Futures podcast, where we've been reflecting on the need for foresight and futures thinking around young people. And the guest today that I have is an old friend and an accomplished thinker in the space of AI, education, climate change, and many other things. So, welcome Urvashi, who is the founder of the Digital Futures Lab in Goa, and we are in their beautiful office here in Goa. And we wanted to have this conversation about what is futures thinking, what is foresight, and why is foresight really important in as a method to think about, to speculate about the future. So yeah, welcome, and I hope we can have some fun.
Yeah, looking forward. Thanks for having me.
So I think the starting was really to say what do you think? You've been listening to different policymakers, industry, civil society, people who've been thinking and speculating about what AI and climate change mean in the next 15, 20 years. So what are you hearing? What's the grand vision for AI, climate change, about in the future? What what is it looking like?
Um, I think there's probably not one vision. There's probably multiple visions depending on who you're asking. I think there is an official kind of government or state vision on what kind of role technology is going to play in advancing socio-economic development in the country. And I think that vision is really about how AI and other technologies are going to help us leapfrog many of our existing development challenges and improve efficiency, improve equity, improve inclusion, improve people's access to public services, so on and so forth. So that's, I think, like the official vision, right? And like even the government documents, like AI, the Niti Aayog's strategy document on AI talks about this when it talks about AI for all. But in some sense, it's also like a half-baked vision, right? The question of how that leapfrogging is going to happen, or how is it that AI is actually going to advance equity, or how is it that AI is actually going to advance inclusion, those pieces I feel have not been thought out well enough. There is an assumption in that vision that just providing people access to technology or providing people access to AI, somehow that it'll be enough and the rest will just play out, right? Like you kind of press play and then kind of hope for the best. So there is a very grand vision, and I think on paper it sounds good, but if you start like kind of scratching the surface a little bit, I think the nuts and bolts of how pieces link together are not that well articulated. And I think that kind of vision is also what you see within a lot of the kind of technology developers, startup ecosystem in the country, where they're similarly thinking of kind of, AI helping address financial inclusion, improving access to public healthcare, but the rest of it remains kind of unpacked, right? So I think that's the kind of official position, and then the industry position. I think there is, in some sense, I think like the like a broader public has not been engaged in their vision of technology futures, right? So what would they want AI to actually do for them? Or how would they like digital technologies to actually transform their lives? Like that conversation, I think, hasn't happened. And I think what we see a lot is that the folks who are building the technology and the folks who are using the technology, there's a huge space between them. So it's not just, the distance between Silicon Valley and India, it's also the distance between Bangalore and the rest of the country as well, right? So that vision, I think, is what maybe we need to start thinking, and I'm guessing that's also the purpose of these podcast series that you're doing, is trying to craft what that vision might be, and for different stakeholder groups.
Yeah. I mean, we hear a lot about, this grand thing around AI for all, AI for some, AI for few, which is sort of driving a lot of the thinking of, say, the government. But what you're saying in terms of, there needs to be more visions that need to be incorporated into the future. It's not just a government vision or a corporate vision, but it's also about the people's own vision of their own lives, and how can we be, listening to those ideas as well as we think about the future. Because oftentimes those are the ones that get left out from the vision of the future.
Yeah. And I think there's actually really good examples that show that. So if you look in the agricultural sector, and you'll see, like, amongst farmers, there's like genuine like app fatigue. Like, they don't want another app, right? They have a gazillion apps and they're switching between these apps, and they really don't want another app. So that tells you something, right? It tells you that there are folks who are building these apps for farm advisories, crop advisories, so on and so forth. And there's lots of money being put into it. There's lots of investors, there's lots of philanthropic money, but it's not matching what the farmer actually wants. So the point around app fatigue should already tell us that there's some disconnect, even in the kind of tech for good space, about what people actually want technology to do for them and the kind of technology that is being developed currently.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And I think that's also about, are we really listening to the people and their lives more deeply than going with the pre-baked solutions that we think will be the ones that will drive the change. We see the same in the teacher education space as well. And the best example I can give is sometimes, one teacher is having one headphone on the left ear and another headphone in the right ear, and they're sort of listening to training programs that are being given to them, and that's a classic picture of overdoing certain things. So
that's a great visual. This overburdened teacher.
Exactly. And in this case, I think you gave a agriculture example. Do you have, any thoughts of, say, this vision of AI for, say, education, or AI for work? Any thoughts on education and work?
Yeah, I mean, I think on both, and we were talking about this earlier, right? I think the vision currently is a very use case driven kind of vision. So India will become the use case capital of the world. We will build lots and lots of use cases. But I'm not sure that many use cases together will add up to the kind of system change that we need. So you still need like a broader theory of change, let's say for the education sector, or whether it's about improving labor force participation, and then need to make technology respond to that theory of change, right? Work to advance that theory of change. And that theory of change really needs to come from domain experts. It needs to come from people who are working on the ground, like you guys, who actually understand what the context is. And it needs to be set by a public policy vision, not by kind of market dynamics on its own. So if you think about in the case of the education sector, or in the context of work, I think there's a lot of and you would know this better than me, of course, but there's a lot of applications that support students in upskilling, reskilling, improving their educational opportunities, etc. But unless simultaneously we also have some kind of public policies that create jobs for people, right, that do that work, that take that kind of industrial policy view, okay, this is where I need to invest public resources, given what the state of the country is, etc., there's going to be a mismatch between what students know and learn and their aspirations and what the labor market can actually provide. And I think I mean, we don't want a situation where literally like people are just constantly having to like upskill themselves to catch up with the latest technological trend, right? Which you see already happening. Like if a year ago we were teaching people how to prompt on generative AI, like in a year from now, that prompting space will look very different. So that can't be the expectation in some sense, right? So I think even in the education sector, whether it's thinking about the labor market, like we need to think about what are the change that we really need, and what are those kind of levers in change, and what can technology do to kind of drive those.
Yeah. So shifting a little bit about, the foresight as a method, and, you've been doing a lot of that work with over the last 5-7 years. Can you say a little bit more about what is foresight as a method, and to get us started on that?
Yeah, sure. So we've been working in the space of foresight for the past couple of years. It's a new space to us. I wouldn't say by any stretch of the imagination we're experts. We're also kind of, feeling our way through this space. But essentially, foresight is about thinking about, well, there's two ways of thinking about it. One, foresight is about anticipating what the consequences of today's decision making might be, right? And building that kind of anticipatory knowledge so that we can avoid harmful lock-ins today. So whether that's a harmful technological lock-in or that's a harmful public policy lock-in. So building that kind of anticipatory muscle almost to make better decisions today. I think another part about foresight is to really challenge the idea that we live in a kind of deterministic world, right? And instead to say that there's multiple possible futures. And we have choice and an agency in crafting what those multiple possible futures are. And so part of foresight is then imagining what that plausible future might look like. And then kind of backcasting from that to think about, okay, we have this vision of what we want that future to look like. How do we get there? Importantly, foresight is not prediction, right? We're not in any way kind of predicting the future.
Yeah. So obviously this can be done at many levels, right?
Yeah.
It can be done at an individual level, it can be done at a community level, it can be done at a systems level. So how do you, do it? Like, do you do it at a systems thinking level? Do you do it with smaller groups which are very geographical, or do you start from the individual and then go to the system?
I think a lot of what our work kind of builds on is the idea that, we need to bring kind of multiple stakeholders together for some common sense making. So we really need to understand what is the problem that we're trying to solve, like spend some time in the problem diagnosis before we even start solutioning. So keeping that kind of perspective in mind, a lot of our foresight work is to bring together different stakeholder groups. So not so much at an individual level in our work, but more at a stakeholder group level. So let's say a grassroots organization that works on gender and sexuality together with the ministry, someone from the ministry who works on women and child rights. So try and bring these different stakeholder groups together to understand what are the points at which they can come together to craft a common future, or even to understand what is the divergence in their understanding and their expectation of the future.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting point about, really bringing the divergence and with unexpected stakeholders who may not speak to each other otherwise, but when you actually bring them together at that sort of intersection of these divergent views is perhaps an emergence of newer possibilities that they may also unpack through that process.
Yeah.
So maybe have you observed that happening?
No, definitely, yeah. And I think that's in some sense what is so magical to see also. That when you do bring kind of stakeholder groups together and you kind of create a safe space for them to engage, the amount of convergence is in some sense surprising. You would often think that maybe someone who's working in a government position to someone who's working in a grassroots position, or someone tech companies, like they would have very different kind of viewpoints. But actually creating those safe spaces for people to have those conversations is really important. And foresight really helps with that, because foresight allows people to break away from their current kind of anxieties, right?
Yeah.
Which might be about like, okay, if I do this, I might lose the election, or if I do this, I may not get promoted, or if I do this, we might run out of donor money, which are the very real anxieties that stakeholders, whether it's an organization or a government or a technology company, might face.
Yeah.
And those anxieties then sometimes get in the way of us actually coming together and thinking about what is the collective future that you want. So Foresight is, in some sense, a really powerful tool to actually facilitate those kind of conversations and help people kind of look beyond their immediate targets or goals or whatever the drivers might be or that are influencing their thinking or behavior.
Yeah. No, I think that's really interesting that it really allows for more imagination to get unlocked rather than your current challenge that's driving your thinking. That because that was
Yeah.
going to be one of my questions, that what are the real advantages of using foresight,
Yeah.
is to break away from this current dominant mindset ki this is most likely to happen.
I think people don't often, I mean, even in our day-to-day lives, right? Like, even as individuals, forget about as like organizations or stakeholder groups, like, we very rarely actually stop to take pause and really think about, okay, what is the longer or the larger picture that
Yeah.
I'm interested in, etc. We're constantly like firefighting or dealing with the here and now, which is often like a set of challenges or roadblocks that you're trying to kind of overcome. I mean, you know this as someone who runs an organization also, right? Like when you have like leadership folks who come into the organization and they try and do a visioning activity, like where do you want the organization to be 25 years from now? You really have to step out of your everyday manager hat and get into that mind frame, and it takes time and it takes effort and you need dedicated spaces to do that. So I think it's the same, right? Like the same kind of analogy holds. Like you need to take people out of their everyday context and they're thinking about everyday challenges to really think about, okay, where do I want this to go, or how would I like to see this happen. And yeah, I think Foresight is a really powerful tool. I think also as part of Foresight, we also try and bring in an element of kind of storytelling into it. And I think storytelling is similarly like a powerful kind of,
Yeah.
half sister or brother of Foresight, that it also helps people then try and not just think about like, okay, where do I want the world to be, because that can sometimes be hard, but maybe like if I take on the persona of a certain individual, or I try and imagine the life of a particular individual, what would their story look like? So I think and that helps you kind of move between a structural level of thinking and a very individual level of thinking.
I was looking at this particular quote around, those who control the fantasy are the ones who control the future. And, oftentimes we tend to hear fantasies of very few selected people, like, say, for example, this fantasy of driverless cars, which is suddenly become everyone's talking about, driverless cars, or the fantasy about going to Mars, or it's largely been driven by these dominant narratives that are controlled by few people, but we are not listening to, say, the fantasies or the ideas of, say, a young person in Assam or in Odisha who's facing climate change, and they are also then borrowing these fantasies from what is being heard in social media, or that is the dominant narrative, where, say, a young person in Odisha may be saying right now, what we are hearing is that, say, more driverless cars should be used to monitor, say, the coal mines and what's going on there, as opposed to, that driverless car is going to also take away the jobs of people from that community.
People are obviously informed by what they see and hear around them, and also like, well, social media has also reduced our attention span to like close to that of a goldfish. So that also means that the dominant narrative is also a very narrow narrative. It is like an echo chamber that we're hearing, and we only remember what is the most recent or the most kind of fresh. So I think it's very hard to break out of those dominant narratives. But something that you said also makes me think that, when you say like whoever controls the fantasy kind of controls the future, whoever has the fantasy, they also kind of steer the ship of the future. And we're seeing this, right, like so clearly in the case of like the tech bros. Like it's literally like a handful of white men and their idea of what the world should be like, and that is shaping how things are rolling out. And when you hear those visions, or you realize, oh, it's so stark that they are also very out of touch with reality, right? They are very, very out of touch with what's actually happening and what the consequences of some of those visions might be. And in some sense, the example that you're giving about the kids in Orissa, it's not that it's similar, of course, but that, when they're saying that we want driverless cars, and this is, and in the coal mines, they are also not equally aware or cognizant of what the kind of consequences of that could be, or what the kind of spillover impacts of that could be. So whether it's like a tech bro and their fantasy, or whether it's kind of like very community driven kind of participatory foresight, I think as foresight practitioners, we also have then a responsibility to bring in tools that inform people and provide that base on which foresight is done. Otherwise, you'll just keep reproducing these dominant visions in an almost reckless fashion, where you're not thinking about what the consequences might be. Or as foresight practitioners, at least we have the responsibility then to kind of push people to really not just craft that alternative vision, but okay, now what does this mean for this person? What does this mean for this person? What might it mean for the environment? What might it mean for, your cousin who's a driver? So that even those visions are in some sense more inclusive and thought through, and not kind of unidimensional. Otherwise, maybe they remain at the level of something that's quite superficial.
Can you sort of give an example of, say, applying it to climate change, and how did you, say, break away from a dominant narrative?
Maybe I'll give an example in the case of work,
Yeah.
rather than climate change. In the use of AI and technology for work, we see a lot of new applications for customer service agents.
Yeah.
Right? Like you want to book an airline, or you want to cancel your airline, you call them, it's an automated customer service agent. You call your bank, it's an automated customer service agent. And on the kind of face of it, it seems fine. Like, what's wrong with having an automated customer service agent? But if you kind of push a little bit further, you kind of see that this is actually not helping anyone, right? In the sense that it doesn't increase productivity. Like as a consumer, you and I are not actually enjoying talking to this automated customer service agent. I don't know anyone who would rather talk to a banking bot or whatever than actually have someone to talk to. And at the same time, it is going to contribute to large-scale job displacement in India, or at least take away the possibility of creating jobs in that kind of entry-level service sector, which is really important for a country like India, where you have a large population moving out of the agrarian economy and joining exactly those kind of sectors, right? So whether it's a customer service agent or a self-checkout kiosk, another place where I don't know anyone who's had a good experience trying to flash that barcode and making it work. But it seems fine. So, but that's an example of where if you just take pause and just think of what the implications of something like this might mean, it would mean that a lot of kids who are coming, or a lot of young people who are moving out of agriculture, don't have these entry-level jobs. It would mean that you have really dissatisfied customers. It would mean that there is yes, a new industry that will be set up of like the more elite, going back hiring human agents to deal with the automated customer service agents, and the only folks it really helps is the companies themselves, because then they can kind of shift the burden onto the consumer, right? They don't have to kind of do anything. So that's not even like a far future scenario. It's like a really near here and now scenario. But if you look at the number of customer service agents applications that are on the market right now, it's mind-boggling, right? And coming back to the point earlier also on like public policy and like use cases, that's also an example of if you just take a use case approach and don't have that public policy angle to it, you're not really advancing the socio-economic goals that you set out to do.
So how do you think foresight can shift this imagination, what you just described, where not everyone in the whole system are actually happy, just the industry is perhaps, it's working for industry. Now, how can foresight help shift this dominant understanding, saying ki industry will gain, others will
Yeah.
lose. Can we create an alternate scenario where there is win-win? Do
Yeah,
you?
I think that would be the idea, right? That something like Foresight could help you map out these future consequences and build ideally kind of compelling narratives about those future consequences, and have a role then in influencing policy or influencing decision makers on what these might be. And I think eventually people respond to stories, right? People respond to narratives that they can understand, narratives that they can relate to. So if one can show that, like, okay, here in 5 years from now, this is what this world looks like, and is that really the world that you want to be in, then that's hopefully like a compelling tool to actually shift some thinking within those who are kind of making decisions, and then to similarly see, okay, what might I actually want these tools to be used for, right? What might be a better use of an automated chatbot kind of thing? Is it really for customer service, or is it maybe something else? And that's the foresight work, I guess, we need to do to figure out what it is the alternative is.
And you think that sometimes we tend to just throw technologies at sort of what is the possible ways technologies can be used, rather than sort of focusing on what's the problem you're trying to
Yeah.
solve, and then think of technology. Is
Yeah.
is that a pattern you're
Yeah.
seeing in the larger ecosystem
Yeah,
as
yeah,
well?
for sure. I mean, we end up, I think, building technology that's easy to build. I think in the startup space is also like a startup culture of like fail fast,
Yeah.
right? If you quickly try out things, roll it out, fail fast, try something else, etc. And if we're gonna be serious about like doing good development work and doing good technology, yes, we want to iterate, but you actually also need to understand the problem space a lot better.
Yeah. So when we speak to young people, oftentimes, especially about climate change, and we were doing that over the last year and a half, they have a lot of anxiety about the climate crisis, and oftentimes, it's driven by these narratives of individual action that also needs to be taken. Say, for example, I need to plant a tree to solve the climate crisis, which is the very simplistic notion, to the anxiety that I'll have to migrate from, say, my geography, because it's going to, say, floods in Assam are going to impact our whole sort of community. And, you know, I guess the issue is moving beyond individual to more systemic understanding of the climate crisis, right? And one can't be just thinking about how individual actions can improve or
Yeah.
change the situation. So, how do you think foresight as a method could help, say, young people or others move away from this individual to systemic understanding of climate change or climate crisis?
I mean, one of the things that I think that foresight as a tool helps us do is join the dots between various different things that are happening in the world, right? And look at how the interaction of seemingly unconnected things might, over a certain period of time, come to create outcomes or impacts that could be impactful or significant, right? And I think that that might be one of the ways in which foresight can help young people also think about the climate crisis and appreciate the systemic forces that are driving that climate crisis, rather than only thinking about their own individual actions or their own kind of individual kind of communities, etc. And in that sense, I think foresight is also an educational tool. It's not only then a tool to help people think about the future, but it's also a tool to give people the tools to understand how things kind of fit together, and then understand how that fitting together of things might lead to a particular kind of outcome. So I think in that way, the foresight could be useful. That being said, I mean, we shouldn't dismiss their anxiety. I mean, their anxieties are also real, and their anxieties, I think, the stories that we gather from their anxieties can also be a really powerful medium for telling stories about the kind of change that we need, or telling stories about the kind of impact that the climate crisis is happening, because very often climate conversations are, at a very high scientific kind of level or at a kind of policy level, and we need to look at the people who are actually impacted by it. So, we want to preserve that sense of anxiety because it is a kind of existential threat, while at the same time helping people piece together the different pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah. No, I think that's really useful because I think futures and foresight as a pedagogy
Yeah.
for learning about the future, I think can be a really powerful way to also engage young people in understanding the systemic challenges that are actually holding things together or that are impacting the whole system. So I
Yeah.
think foresight is actually a great pedagogical
Yeah.
framework
Yeah.
if we think about it in the context of education, and how does one actually refine that process to feel that, to get young people to feel that they can actually shape the desired futures that they want.
Exactly. And I think it's also, like good foresight work also requires a good understanding of how we got here. To actually think about the future and think about possible trajectories, you need to get a sense of how did we arrive at this current moment. So from a pedagogical lens, foresight can also be a way to support that more systemic understanding of how we arrived at the current moment, to see the kind of levers of change or drivers of change, the kind of push and pull factors, and then to draw that continuity between the past and the future. I think that's also an important aspect of foresight. So we don't think that we're starting from from zero or from scratch. Yeah.
How does all of this add up into action, for or into framing of policies themselves, that we can do a lot of this foresight work, speculative thinking? What's the so what of that? Can we inspire policymakers to listen to multiple futures? Can we get policymakers to observe the interaction between the policy and the practice of it?
Yeah.
Can they tell better stories of why things are not working to inspire communities to think differently? But the question is, what can foresight do for policy and
Yeah.
policy action in
Yeah.
your view?
I think all of those in some sense. Foresight can be a really powerful tool for policymakers to get a better understanding of what people's desires are, what people's anxieties are, in a way that is often not captured by your typical kind of data collection methods like a census or something like that, right? Like actually give you a more qualitative, lived experience understanding of what people are experiencing and where they want to go. I think foresight can also help policymakers understand what are the tools that they need to put in place today if they want to actually enable some of those futures or disable some of those futures. What do they actually need to do? And it can also just help them, I think differently, right? Like I think policymakers are perhaps the most burdened by like the everyday decision making and everyday kind of pressures and firefighting in some sense, and probably don't get that time and space to do that more imaginative or blue sky thinking on where things need to go. Maybe at the time of writing like an election manifesto is like the only time it happens, and that's also a very transactional kind of view, right, on what will get you the most popular things. But other than that, it doesn't seem like that kind of visioning work actually happens in policy making. So foresight can help policymakers actually do that. And just to come back to your climate example, right? I think we were looking at this one community in Malaysia that was living in a very flood prone area, and every year the village that they lived in used to get flooded, and every year government would come back and rebuild various things like the school or the hospital or houses or whatever, right? The community center, school center, etc. And there was a really interesting exercise that was done where they realized that actually what the community was most interested in, or what the community wanted also preserved when the government was coming in and doing that risk assessment of what are the areas most vulnerable to flood, was that people actually wanted to preserve or wanted to ensure that their places of worship were included in that flood risk assessment map, because those places of worship were really important places for the community to kind of come together, and many other activities took place in those places of worship, right? And so there was a university there that then used kind of geospatial mapping tools and gave the community the tech tools to be able to create their own maps and their own risk assessment flood vulnerability tools. And then they were able to use those new maps of what they thought was vulnerable and what they thought need to be protected to then shape how decision making was happening at a kind of higher up level. So it was a really nice example of if you start listening to people, you understand their priorities might be different, and actually really advanced technology like something like geospatial AI, which we might think it only belongs in scientific labs. If you ensure that people are provided those tools, they can actually articulate and create those visions that can become roadmaps for policymakers themselves. But you need to equip them with those tools and provide them that kind of support, and then obviously have those channels of communication open across these various stakeholders.
Yeah, I think that's a great example of how participatory approaches can also inform policymakers in a much more nuanced way, rather than taking a very broad brushstroke kind of approach. So
exactly.
I think that therefore foresight can also be used in participatory sort of thinking of policy itself. When we think about youth and how we need to listen to young people while making policies for them, it often sounds and sometimes is tokenistic in the approach, or it's sort of we have heard youth, but do their voices really matter? Are we really listening to young people while making policies? And the need to shift this power dynamic between, say, the beneficiary of a program to the policy maker. How do you think we could rethink this dynamic, which generally plays out while designing policies? The challenge is in their implementation, because we've perhaps not heard fully as to what the problems are, or what young people may really want. So any thoughts on that
From a foresight perspective?
Yeah.
I think a lot of what we see happening when we do youth consultations, that there'll be kind of one-off consultations, right? You'll go into a room, you'll have a meeting, you'll hear people voice their opinions, and then that's kind of it, right? And you'll probably have also a huge diversity of opinions itself that emerge from the room, but then that kind of ends there. I think what's different about foresight is that it's not a consultation. It's not a one-time consultation. Actually, doing good foresight work requires a lot of time and energy and kind of sustained engagement with the community. If we just do a one-off exercise, we're probably not doing it justice. So if we're doing kind of systematic foresight, for an example, you'd even want to ask the youth that you're working with to identify what they see as signals of change, and then to bring those signals of change together and use those interactions between the signals of change to actually build their visions of the future or their concerns about the future. So it allows you, therefore, to not do this one-off kind of engagement. If you do it in a very systematic and serious way, it means investing that time and resources in actually engaging with the community. It becomes a tool. So it helps you, I think, maybe move away from a tokenist kind of one-off kind of engagement to instead a structured, systematic form of engagement over a period of time. I think the other way that it helps maybe move away from a more tokenistic approach is that some amount of consensus building is required when you're doing that foresight work, when they're going to be building these visions of the future or articulating what their idea of a desired future is. There is some kind of consensus building that has to happen, and some kind of negotiation that has to happen within that youth group itself, right? There will be points of tension and points of friction, and in that process of that negotiation, and in the process of kind of crafting, in that process of negotiation, you also then end up crafting a collective vision. And once you have a collective vision that you are able to then articulate, I think that's a much more powerful tool to be holding people in power actually accountable, as opposed to like a diversity of different voices, and that reconciliation work kind of hasn't been done. So I think both in terms of like the if you invest the resources in doing foresight properly, and if the invest the resources and the time to see the foresight process through to its end outcome, you actually have a much more tangible vision for even policymakers to work with. I think policymakers would, of course, there's good and there's bad apples, but in general, I think people are concerned about the youth. And they do have an interest in making sure that what they're doing is in the interest of the youth, etc. But often they just don't have the right information, or they have too many points of information and there isn't a convergence. So if one can use foresight to articulate something and present that to a policymaker, I think that's really powerful. I think that there's also, bad foresight work done poorly can just be dismissed very easily. Also, right? It becomes kind of, oh, this is just fluff, or this is just storytelling. So we have to put in, as foresight practitioners, the work into making sure that foresight methodology and the process is also something that is rigorous in some sense, or stands some kind of like questioning around how we got there. And then I think it's a really powerful tool.
Yeah. What have you seen shift in policymakers with good foresight work? I mean, is it mindsets? Is it being able to understand the problem better from different perspectives? Is it how to action a policy to its natural sort of direction? What do you think is that shift that foresight work has brought for policymakers? And I know it's work in progress.
Yeah.
We are still figuring it out, and nothing has to, conclusively shift in metrics of, M&E and so on. But just from at a surface level, what do you see shift? Or is there anything you see shift?
It's still very early days, and I don't think, for an example, in India, there is a culture of doing this kind of foresight work, right? Whether it's at a more policy level, which is kind of more strategic planning, or at a development organization level, we don't have that. It's not a well-oiled kind of machinery yet. It's still very early days. So I don't know if we've seen too many places where we can point to like, hey, we did this foresight work, and as a result of that, we've seen this shift. But I think that where we maybe can see more tangible shift is that it's also a really powerful tool to just think through the consequences of one's actions, both in terms of the direct consequences as well as the indirect consequences of one's actions. And maybe in doing that kind of consequence mapping is where it has the most kind of resonance with policymakers in terms of helping them plan their immediate kind of decision making or action. But that being said, I don't think we're doing good. I don't think that policymakers are necessarily doing that kind of foresight work very well, or even necessarily learning from the past to think about the future. Just to bring it back to tech and AI, when we started this conversation, there's so much enthusiasm and excitement now on generative AI and large language models and so on and so forth. And you would think that we would have learned the lessons from the past decade of social media and be applying some of those lessons to thinking about the future of AI and AI technology. But we're really not doing that work at all. So I think it's a huge... There's a lot more work to be done before we can actually say that, hey, look, foresight has helped move the needle, at least in the Indian context and the circles that I'm part of.
Yeah. No, I think that's also a realization that, one needs to also start applying this thinking to our own practice as
Yeah.
well, and not just talk about it from a policy lens, and go slow to go fast in a sense. So are we able to, as practitioners, also apply it to our own organizations, our own ways of doing planning, and our own ways of execution?
Yeah, I think
before-
it's very hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very hard. I think, yeah, exactly. If you can do it even at an organizational level, or even in terms of like our immediate partnerships, or, relationships in a professional space, that already is a. And it's hard, huh? Like building that foresight muscle is really hard. We've had many workshops that we've had, which are foresight workshops, and most of the time goes in just trying to get people to put on that foresight hat. And I think also then it just reinforces the point that we need to build it as a tool. We need to use it more regularly. We need to think about how we get people familiar with it so that it comes more easily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's a great point to end on, and thanks for the amazing conversation.
Thank
and,
you.
Lucas.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thank you.
So we'd love to hear your comments and thoughts and reflections on this conversation, and feel free to write to us or like and subscribe this podcast.